Welcome to the Xceptional Insights podcast. I'm Sean Wargo, and I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Hansen. Together, we make up the market intelligence team here at AVIXA,
where it's our job to identify trends in the economy and understand how they affect our industry, the professional audiovisual industry.
Hello, this is Sean Wargo and Peter Hansen of AVIXA, here again for another episode of our Xceptional Insights podcast. We're here to tackle the difficult and wide-reaching topic of tariffs today. We just put out a Q1 meta report that covers tariffs and kind of their potential impact to the Pro AV industry. We are in the process now of investigating, analyzing market conditions for our upcoming release of the 2025 IOTA, of which tariffs will, of course, be a very important topic of coverage there. So we wanted to go wide-ranging with this and kind of see what's happening today and how it might impact Pro AV as an industry. We're going to start, Peter, with just a little bit of synopsis from that Q1 meta. What's our landscape? What's the industry kind of, how are they responding right now? Essentially the lay of land for this.
Right. It's a complex picture out there. And frankly, the kind of like complexity, and I would say that maybe the more key word is uncertainty, is the biggest impact on our industry right now. It's less that tariffs are in place and prices are adjusting through the channel. That's a factor. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But the bigger issue is we don't really know what the tariff picture is going to be. There's a lot of changes happening very frequently. Just an example, last night we heard tariffs on cars happening on April 2nd. As of this recording, that's a very like 1 week, less than a week type turnaround. Very difficult for a company to plan on. And so when you're an end user planning out a project, thinking, what should we budget? What should we attempt to accomplish, say, this summer at our university? It's difficult to set a budget, to set a target, to set a goal, because you don't really know what that pricing structure is going to be. So let's talk a little bit about the tariffs themselves. That's the uncertainty. It's pushing away investment. When you get to the investment stage, what are some of the key factors? Well, number one is the literal additional tax on goods. Primarily the key one for Pro AV is a lot of equipment manufactured in China, shipped to the US as core. If there's a tax on what's passing through the border, that's what a tariff is. Someone has to pay that. And maybe it's collected by the importer, but ultimately it's passed along to a meaningful extent, probably not 100% in every case, but to a meaningful extent, it's going to be reflected in final prices. So you're seeing price increases on goods shipped from China already. Another factor is the steel and aluminum tariffs. These are supposed to be on sort of including derivatives of non-US steel and aluminum. They're a bit more complicated because if it's partially sourced US steel or aluminum in the process, then the tariffs don't apply as currently written. There's a lot of details about, are they emergency tariffs, which are more limited, and how the president is able to design them, versus Section 301, which has to happen after an investigation, and then there can be some more nuance to it. And what you're hearing from me again is a little bit more uncertainty, right? Exactly what's going to be tariffed, taxed on import is unclear, and so it's difficult. Another piece is the tariffs on kind of close allies, Mexico and Canada. A lot of equipment, maybe if it didn't happen for construction or manufacture, I should say, in China, maybe it happened in Mexico, or maybe the supply chain goes through Mexico. That's another key aspect. I would just note as well that there are global equilibrium effects. So it's not just the products that cross the border of the US, because the US is the source of the tariffs, or I would say like the instigator, perhaps is maybe the better word, because there are retaliatory ones, and that's it. If the US puts up trade barriers that stops, let's say, displays coming from China to the US, where do those displays go? Potentially Europe. So they have price impacts in Europe. Let's say there's, a domestic manufacturer for some US Pro AV product, it's not a huge component, but like, or domestic manufacturing in the U.S. is not a huge part of the equipment equation, but even such as there's equilibrium effects because everyone's going to want to buy the parts that are not subject to a tax. So then the demand goes up, the supply can't respond fast enough, and you have maybe some price increases there or some lack of supply. So there's a lot happening, a lot of complexity. The net effects are uncertainty, kind of causing hesitance in investment, especially in the short term, and then these taxes increasing prices. Sean, I know you're tracking the kind of some of the global supplies and kind of the channel effects in a little bit more detail. Tell us a little bit more about kind of some of the impacts there, like what's going to happen with like supply gluts of certain things and supply shortages.
Yeah, I mean, what you're discussing about pricing becomes super relevant in that equation. So as we look at how market might respond, what inventory exists, pandemic, obviously, that was the big thing we were talking about, is actually shortage on a lot of product. Prices went up as a result. So you could see that was almost an example of what can happen as you have these supply system shocks. But what we actually saw over the last couple of years is in some categories, you got an oversupply because that shortage actually created delays in some products or projects where they were waiting for final materials. Meanwhile, they were buying up other components. Some other parts of the supply chain, like for displays, really ramped up. They started shipping a lot of products. So the summary of that is we've heard over the last year or two that in many product categories, displays being most notable, some conferencing collaboration, collaborative tool sets, and hardware has been oversupplied to a lot of parts of the world, which actually has had a deflationary effect. So you could say tariffs coming into this situation and starting to raise prices on goods that are now flowing might help bring some price parity or bring us back up to where those price declines would help us absorb some of the shock. It's theoretical though, because as you're noting, there's the kind of carryover effects where other parts of the projects become more expensive. The budget for the end customer is not just considering changes to the spending that they have for Pro AV. They're also maybe seeing other price increases across all of their other materials or technologies that they're buying. So net, it means a more challenged budget situation for an end user buyer. Like it or not, right? Whatever happens with, tariff impacts directly on Pro AV, there's still the effects of all the other parts of someone's budget. But I think the mixed news on this is there are parts of the world where there is a lot of product in supply chain at distribution, and so there's been price declines, and so this might actually bring those prices back up a little bit. But in the end, that doesn't necessarily benefit manufacturer. That doesn't necessarily benefit channel because they're having to absorb still some tariffs coming in. So kind of a wash effect. I'm curious, though, there's a lot of ways in which the market can respond to these sort of tariffs. Buying early, utilizing existing supply, nearshoring, onshoring as long-term strategies. How are we hearing our channel respond right now in terms, whether it's integrators or distributors, manufacturers? Is there any data that we're seeing that really helps tell that story?
Yeah, the kind of responses were really probably the main focus of the Q1 meta, trying to give a little bit of like a 201 level kind of primer on. So you're fighting some new tariffs. Like, how can you, as a channel member, try to minimize the final cost, both to your business and to your end users as well? That included some data collection from kind of like December before the administration came in, before it was maybe like quite as clear how much tariffs were going to be a priority. There's clear signal before the election, but I think there was doubts that it was going to be at this level that we've seen. We have data from January as well. At the end of January, early February, it was like maybe starting to become clear. We were seeing some activity. There was some stocking up, not a lot of stocking up. More manufacturing distributors naturally than integrators or end users, but they weren't going crazy. And frankly, I think they're being relatively smart to not go crazy, because it's just, I don't know what tariff I would tell you to bank on. Like, yes, buy now, maybe pay a premium price because you're trying to front run and everyone's trying to front run. So shipping's expensive today. And then, you stock up your warehouse and all the costs associated with that. And then just assume that you're going to win when the tariffs are in place and you're selling 2 months from now. Well, gosh, like maybe China gives a concession and then the tariffs go away, or our president negotiates a specific product exception, or it's just postponed, for whatever reason. I think that's a tricky one. And so our industry, we've seen our industry be a little bit more hesitant. I think probably a little bit more hesitant than some other industries. I think kind of the main responses has been like, I'm not going to try to like outguess this situation. I'm just going to adjust prices. I'm going to pass them on. And I think the one advantage that, like, this is a terrible silver lining, but it is a silver lining from the supply crisis that we went through in the pandemic and in the recovery from the pandemic, is that end users got more comfortable with this, and suppliers got a lot better at this structuring of contracts to say, like, look, we're starting a project today. We're going to be buying equipment in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I can't promise you a certain timeline, a certain price. Like, we're going to have some clauses built in here, so nobody's holding too much of the bag on a product that I cannot promise the way I would like to be able to, the way I was able to in 2019, or the way I was maybe able to in 2024. To get a little bit more greenfield, kind of like, or let's say farther afield from like stocking up, or let's say front running the tariffs. I touched on buying domestic, which, like, it's great, but like everyone wants to do it. Mm-hmm. It's potentially quite a limited option. But there are a lot of other strategies. So, for example, the only thing that has to be included in terms of like, or has to be subject to a tariff, is the manufacturing cost of the product that's crossing the border. So, okay, like manufacturing cost, that's seems like a lot of the cost, but product design, product marketing, product support, warranty, these are all things that, especially if you're a multinational company, you have an office in the US, you have an office in China, or you can potentially locate those costs in the US, and then the final cost of this product you're selling isn't subject to the tariff. It's only a certain percent. And then we can also see that case with certain maybe technologies that are a little bit less subject. So like the example I've been giving out is DV-LED versus maybe a flat panel display that maybe trying to use. You have an area, maybe you're thinking video wall, you're thinking DV-LED. DV-LED is maybe a bit more expensive. Certainly the installation is really high cost, but that installation is happening in country. It's not subject to tariff. Now you're just getting these DV-LED units, and they're a little bit lower cost because it's just, it's not really a finished product. And I mean, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of can tilt the equation a little bit. There's some other things from maybe some manufacturers going to be thinking about, like in terms of components, especially as we get a more crystallized view of like, okay, if I have American sourced products, then perhaps this final good will not be subject to the tariff, or not be subject to the same level of tariff. There's lots and lots of details that you can try to create more value in country, try to engineer around tariffs to minimize the cost. Just want to emphasize the importance of that, because these tariffs are going to be like a difficulty multiplier for people in the channel. But, there's an extent to which business is a zero-sum game. And like, if you are handling this difficulty multiplier better than your competitors, it can be a win. It can be a market share win. If everyone's price goes up X percent on average, but you're below X% because you figured out the smart ways to get to minimize your company's tariff liability, and your competitors didn't, like, it can be a win for you. So I do want to emphasize that there are a lot of ways around it, and some companies could turn that into a win for themselves, even if it's on net. Like, it makes it harder for the AV industry. It's not a positive, let's say, for the joy, and maybe it's a little bit positive on total revenue, but like in terms of total equipment, it's less of a positive. Let's talk about that more, because that total revenue question, kind of the net out, is something you're looking into really deeply right now as we formulate the new IOTA, which it's kind of a good timing one where we need that refresh to say, like, look, there's a tariff picture. Maybe we don't know exactly what it is, but like, let's have a framework. Let's get some assumptions on paper with the information we know. How is that starting to net out?
Yeah, actually, I want to touch on something. You raised an interesting point, too, as a creative response mechanism to tariff situations. So if we think about AV and what it does in the industry, and the fact that we as a technology sector net add value, right? We take raw components, we envision, specify solutions, the sum is greater than the parts, right? So that is an interesting notion that the channel integrators, distributors, manufacturers have an opportunity in kind of sort of getting creative with that last bit of assigned and added value that may help kind of think about how things are priced so that it's not avoiding tariff, but it's minimizing the impact of the tariff to the total project. Because as we can guess, as we kind of translate this into our industry forecast, the challenge for the integrator side is, as price of materials increase, the service component gets strained in terms of the amount of then additional value, additional cost that the project that the integrator can bring into the project. So that shifts the balance sheet a bit more towards the hardware side, and or forces the integrator to get really creative about which products, how they specify, do they compromise on some technology component in order to ensure a better integration, a better utilization, a better outcome ultimately. Because no matter what, the client expects that the end result cannot be compromised. Cost is one consideration, but as all integrators would attest, it's also the reliability, the efficacy of the solution in the end. So weighing all this into consideration, we had already said that coming out of the pandemic, we kind of went through a recovery period. We benefited as an industry from that recovery, even though we took a very hard hit in 2020 as an industry. We've largely recovered from that. So we're already in a normal inflection point. We're already in a renormalization phase where growth is played out. You can see it in our existing forecasts. Unlike the pandemic period where we were conservative, and so each year we ended up adjusting up the end result for the prior year. The last year and a half or two has been more about, okay, now it seems like growth is starting to taper a little faster than we thought. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's, a supply chain constraint or an end user consideration for a refresh cycle. But clearly we were already in that phase. And so tariffs are coming at a point at which it was already increasingly important for our companies that use data to gauge long-term opportunity to take another compass point. A lot of times our data is really used for not necessarily a measure of the exact size of the market, but also to take a compass and know the industry's headed in this direction. This is my opportunity for us. So we're going to go there. So we're absolutely now considering tariffs as an input to that process. How will that impact the incoming demand? How will that impact the pricing structure? How will that impact, therefore, the size and growth of the industry? Obviously, we would expect a GDP hit if there is, a meaningful pullback on spend at large by end user buyers. GDP suffers a little bit. That was already kind of being talked about, I think, at the Fed levels. This year's GDP coming in a little bit light, from what I understand. And so that's the context in which we would therefore also expect a Pro AV number to be a little bit less. The bad news, I think, for the Pro AV industry, among many things that we're kind of talking about here, is we really had thought that 2025, 2024 was kind of a dip in growth, and that 2025 we might start to see a rebound. The reality is we look at it now, and it's still obviously in review, but 2025 is looking like a further decline in growth rate by probably a couple points off of where we were. So if it was a 6.5, maybe it's more like a 4.5 as kind of a rough example. That's still to be determined, because as we're talking about, a price point increase can actually give you a little bit of an artificial growth, but you would expect that that's offset by, say, a hedging effect. So maybe you net neutral, but more likely, giving all things considered, the degree of pullback by companies buying, that we would expect to decline in overall Pro AV spending for the year. I think the jury is out, and I certainly would love for us to get to the point where, okay, we're back to estimating a growth at a very conservative level, and lo and behold, the market context is better and the consumers are buying at a higher rate. And I think, as you kind of teed up, there's a lot of uncertainty with this. There's not many knowns, and that is really the problem. It doesn't matter the perspective on, do you agree or not agree with the tariff implementation and its long-term strategy? It's, as a business impactor to decision making, there's clearly a cooling effect, put it mildly, on kind of the whole market. What else? Is there anything else that we've missed that we should expect as we kind of think about that Pro AV? Maybe you and I have talked about in the past of, upside in things like the experience economy. Is there anything else that we should be kind of thinking about? Maybe it's on the consumer side and sort of their spending too, and how that might trickle down into Pro AV.
Yeah, I think there is one potential positive, not sold, not predicting this as like a more than 50% likelihood. But I think something to keep in mind for integrators. Before I mention that, I want to say the one negative we kind of like brushed on, maybe lower growth in 2025, concerns about, how GDP is kind of the rising tide that Pro AV grows off of. We're such a diverse industry. We touch so many parts of the economy. We do rely on a healthy GDP to keep our industry growing even more healthily in general. The odds of a recession in 2025 have increased pretty meaningfully since the start of the year. There's growing consensus that Trump one's kind of approach to the economy, philosophically, not just like literal policies, but just sort of the way they're interpreting data and responding, is different, or was different than like the Trump 2. And a really key interview that really kind of moved the needle in terms of like recession prediction type markets was one where our president was asked about if he thought a recession in 2025 was possible, potentially, related to some of these tariff difficulties and other economic challenges. And he was surprisingly equivocal about it. Now, I think that the theory of Trump, one, was he watched the market pretty closely. He's following the stock market, S&P 500. And like, if it looks bad, he takes that as like, I should adjust my approach. And if it looked good, that was a pat on the back. He made a good decision. And I think in the Trump 2, he's clearly not following that so closely. That's less of an important feedback mechanism to him. And I think people interpreted that interview in particular, and sort of the more general thrust of these recent few months, as there is a willingness to break more things, potentially see more negative news in 2025 because they have a plan or have a number of plans, they have some goals, and so there is more realistic odds of lower GDP growth in 2025. Not predicting recession, the odds are against it. But it's good to keep in mind, why you need to continually update your own company's projections, your sort of view of the size of the market, because what 2025 is shaping up to look like from a purely economical perspective is a little less positive than what you would have said 3 months ago. Now, that positive that I mentioned, the first project I ever did at AVIXA looked back at the Great Recession and how Pro AV fared through the Great Recession. Because historically, there's some other companies out there that still kind of use the same metric, but new construction was used as sort of like the leading indicator for Pro AV. Today's new construction is tomorrow's integration product. Clearly true. And very scary if you're talking about recession or frankly, these tariffs, which are likely to create some pretty significant construction industry challenges. The good news that we got from that research is that Pro AV seems to be a little bit of a substitute for new construction. So if you can't renovate your whole building or build a new office, you can touch it up with some new paint, some new interior design, and some quality AV. Much cheaper. So that's potentially an option. I would say that's something to maybe encourage integrators, the channel, to use to market. Like, look, new construction is expensive, but I can make your old office building look new at a fraction of the cost. Okay, maybe, it's still going to have some old bones, like we're taping over some stuff, but with good AV, it's going to be a really compelling environment. So I think that's maybe the positive, where we try to shift some of that, the dollars are more scarce for capital improvements for offices or hotels or amusement parks or whatever space. But if we can say we're the cheaper option, Pro AV is the cheaper. Pro AV is getting more expensive, but it's cheaper than doing a full new construction. Mm-hmm. So why don't you spend 25% more on Pro AV and spend 50% less on new construction? Accept a huge budget reduction, but by focusing on that just the final step. Mm-hmm. That's something that we definitely saw in the Great Recession, that maintenance and repair spending that came over to Pro AV, renovation spending that came over to Pro AV, soaked up a little bit of a deficit from new construction. So if we can make that happen again in a tariff environment, in a potential recession environment, that could be a way to reinforce our industry. And I would certainly encourage the channel to be thinking about how can you market that? Because okay, maybe the Pro AV cost is higher, but if you can save money on other bigger costs, new construction, that's a potentially significant win for our industry.
Yeah, for sure. I'd say that the thing you and I have talked a lot about is agility across so many. I mean, as a response mechanism, any Harvard Business Review sort of case study is going to talk about the importance of that as in periods of disruption and challenge. Pandemic is another period. Great Recession, good example of how the market of Pro AV is able to respond to the contextual, still provide benefit, solution, revenue growth for itself by serving needs. At pandemic, similarly, we had to pivot. Yes, clearly a downward trend for us as an industry as live events, in-person activity really decline. But we shift, towards hybrid work, broadcast AV capabilities. So that is the important thing for us to keep in mind as we look at these sort of headwind effects, and sort of you can get very caught up and concerned and hand-wringing about the potential opportunity for Pro AV. But at the other side of that, our palette, our available set of solutions is so extensive. There's plenty of places, digital signage, learning, conferencing, broadcast, security, surveillance, performance, et cetera, that we remain robust against a lot of those shocks is kind of what we're talking about. Talk to me a little about the consumer side. Any concerns there as we look forward?
With the consumers, where I think you start to get concerned is the overall economic environment. The consumer has remained very resilient. Everyone's been, I think, really grateful for how much strength there has proven to be through inflation, through uncertainty. They've been the engine of the economy, especially in the U.S. Now, they're also facing potential cost increases. Certainly looks likely on their cars, but potentially on many other products. They buy many Chinese imports as well. How they respond is an open question. Could that be a push towards the experience economy? We've seen the experience economy rebound. but potentially, yes. I mean, if goods are more expensive, then services are relatively cheaper. And, of course, goods are needed to run those experiential economies, but their costs are distributed over a lot more people. It's not like I own the good, I use it infrequently. It's company purchase a probably more expensive good that then used and has that cost amortized across many thousands of people potentially. So could there be a silver lining there? Potentially. I would not say that tariffs are an immediate negative for Pro AV via the consumer mechanism. I'd be more concerned about the consumer to Pro AV effect pipeline happening via an economic disruption. Like if these unlikely, but more likely than they used to be, odds of a recession hit, that's where I'd start to get more concerned about how those consumer dollars would filter on through to our Pro AV B2B industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, certainly we talk a lot about experience economy as a key component. The less consumers are out spending on experiences, the more that might impact us. But you also touched on another topic that we didn't really go into today, which you will see as part of the 2025 IOTA, and that is the mix of software and service in there too. As hardware becomes more expensive, it might accelerate the need or a tendency to want to try to solve a problem instead of throwing hardware at it, throw software or a service component at it. So once again, though, still a part of that story of agility, opportunity, flexibility within the market, within Pro AV to be able to adjust to the trends.
Yeah.
Well, certainly a lot more to explore on this topic. Look forward to our 2025 IOTA update as we incorporate tariffs as a kind of headwind for our industry. Otherwise, we will clearly dive deeper in future Xceptional Insights podcast. Thanks for joining us. Sean and Peter signing out.